and welcome to the special live recording of PRS Global Open Deep Cuts. I'm your host, Dr. Puru Nagarkar, and I'm very pleased to introduce my two guests today, Dr. PRS Butler and Dr. Nicole Sommer. Dr. Butler is an associate professor in the Division of Plastic Surgery at the Yale University School of Medicine. He's also the inaugural Yale Department of Surgery Vice Chair of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the GME Assistant DEI Director at Yale School of Medicine. He's a director of the American Board of Surgery. He's board certified by both the American Board of Surgery and the American Board of Plastic Surgery, and is a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Sommer is a professor in the Division of Plastic Surgery at the Southern Illinois University in Springfield, Illinois. She is the director of the SIU Cosmetic Clinic and the Plastic Surgery Residency Program Director. She's also the chair of the ASPS Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Butler, Dr. Sommer, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
So today we're discussing a new mini-series from PRS Global Open targeting inclusive excellence in plastic surgery. It's a collection of 4 papers from our guests focusing on inclusion and diversity in plastic surgery. So I want to start with your respective papers about the contributions and the evolution of black plastic surgeons and women plastic surgeons. I found these 2 papers fascinating because they were like 2 parallel histories, right, of plastic surgery. One focusing on how black plastic surgeons have made their way through the ranks and over the last 100 years, and the other on women. And they really highlighted, I thought, several important issues like explicit bias, implicit and systemic bias, and the importance of informal and formal support systems. But what I want to start with is I want both of you to tell us a couple of stories about the people you wrote about. There's a lot of inspiring stories in here. And I have to imagine there was more you could have written and you just couldn't because of the inherent limitations of word counts that you kind of get when you're publishing something. So a question for each of you, Dr. Butler, Dr. Sommer. Who are some of the people you wrote about that inspired you the most? And tell us a bit about their life and career.
You want me to start?
Sure.
So, Puru, thank you very much. I would be remiss if I didn't start by really thanking Jeff Janis and Aaron and Donnell and you and PRS Global Open's team for being forthright with supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. There's no mystery that DEI is kind of under attack. It's been politicized in such a fashion. I don't even use the terminology DEI anymore without talking about inclusive excellence. I really think that it's important that we focus on, and where this all came from is disparities that occur in the United States, right? And if we keep the lens on disparities and the fact that there are people in our country that are receiving disparate care relative to others, then I think it will bring in more people kind of agnostic of one's political persuasion, right? If it's about the patients, then we don't have to necessarily wonder about, the zero-sum game of, well, if they get an opportunity, then others do not. Enhancing the workforce as it pertains to diversity really is just one mechanism that we know can help alleviate healthcare disparities, and I don't think we can lose that component of it either. It's been effective, and we have good evidence that a more diverse workforce is going to be better for diverse communities, but the community at large. So I want to thank PRS Global Open publicly for, again, being rather unapologetic, putting forth a DEI series on your dime in order to enhance this effort and also kind of amplify surgeons from diverse backgrounds that are contributing to the literature. So I need to thank you first and foremost for that.
I think PRS Global Open's done a great job with that for sure.
So as it pertains to the manuscript that we wrote relative to black and brown surgeons that have contributed to plastic and reconstructive surgeon, I have a laundry list of surgeons that I could talk about. I will kind of highlight a couple, and then maybe further in the conversation we'll talk about a few more. So the first one that immediately comes to mind is a gentleman that I was fascinated by. I guess a little context of the manuscript. So I give a lot of credit to the first author. It's a medical student by the name of Josh Glahn, who was working on a combined MD master's degree in surgical history, which I didn't even know was a thing. So he came to me with this interest and asked if I would be willing to collaborate. And I said, absolutely. I'm privileged to be at Yale. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and we have these exhaustive libraries. We're also not far from the headquarters of the American Board of Plastic Surgery. So we were able to kind of use all of that information to come up with this manuscript. So a lot of credit goes to him. So one of the initial folks that I came across who I'd never heard of before was a gentleman by the name of Dr. DeHaven Hickson. So this was a black medical officer who spanned both the World War I and World War II.
Oh, wow.
And that is a huge accomplishment in and of itself, because there was an era, obviously, in the 1920s and 30s, and even in the early 1940s where the U.S. Army was segregated.
Right.
So this gentleman spanned World War I, World War II as a medical officer. He retires from the military. He goes to Philadelphia. I'm very fond of Philadelphia. My mother's from Philadelphia. I spent a long time at Penn, and worked at a hospital called Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital, segregated, black, founded hospital in Center City, Philadelphia. And there in the 1920s, he actually ran a course called Nursing of Plastic Surgery Patients, which led us to believe that a lot of plastic surgery was actually happening in this hospital.
Right.
The other thing that was interesting, Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital was founded by a black surgeon by the name of Nathan Moselle. Nathan Moselle's claim to fame is that he was the first black student to graduate from Penn School of Medicine, which is the oldest medical school in the country, in the late 1890s. So Nathan Moselle graduates from medical school, couldn't be trained at Penn, had to actually go overseas to become trained as a surgeon, comes back to Philadelphia. Some wealthy philanthropists from Penn help him found Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital, and he, back to Dr. Hickson, worked together operating on patients. They weren't claimed plastic surgeons, but clearly as general surgeons who were doing thoracic surgery and endocrine surgery and surgeonc, they were also doing plastic surgery. So that's one person that immediately, I think, requires and necessitates some further amplification.
Yeah.
And then the second is Dr. Arthur Garnes. Many folks in the audience know Dr. Arthur Garnes. We have a society named in his honor that meets here annually as a component or in conjunction with the American Society of Plastic Surgery. Arthur Garnes, kind of the first black American plastic surgeon is how we've kind of framed him. Yeah. Trained at Howard and then Harlem Hospital, was the first black person to be a program director of a plastic surgery training program in 1972, which was not all that long ago. No. So those are the folks that immediately kind of come to mind for me.
Yeah. Dr. Sommer?
Yes, thanks. So I wanted to also acknowledge, this doesn't seem very loud.
No.
I want to also acknowledge my primary the primary author of my article, Jesse Kiljonen, who is a resident at SIU, and then also Jane Petro, who is a retired plastic surgeon who helped gather a lot of the information that we were able to attain. And she had been doing that over the years on her own accord, just because she was so interested in knowing about the women in plastic surgery. So I think the person that we wrote about is the main person was Elma Dane Morani. She graduated from Medical College of Pennsylvania, and she applied to plastic surgery 6 times. She was only able to finally obtain a position with Barrett Brown after the 6th try down in St. Louis. And the conditions of her acceptance were that she could only operate on Saturday when all of the men were no longer in the OR. And she could only observe during the week. So on the weekdays, she just observed. And on the weekends, on Saturday, she was actually able to operate. So she finished her residency out in that capacity, and then ended up going, a similar situation, ended up going to Europe, where you were more accepted to actually do a lot more training in areas of plastic surgery. And then she did go back to Pennsylvania and started her practice, and she was started actually the first specialty hand clinic in Pennsylvania. She started it there. So, and she was she was admitted into ASPS in 1948.
I think both of those stories kind of highlight one of the interesting things that these papers talk about, right? Which is the effect of both the explicit barriers that were set up. So, not being allowed to train at Penn, even though you're the first graduating black medical student and you have to leave the country. But also the implicit barriers of, you had to apply 6 times. Well, what happened the first 5 times? Maybe it wasn't an explicit, you're not allowed because you're a woman, but there was some implicit barrier there that was preventing someone from getting in. So over time, the explicit barriers can go away, but sometimes the implicit ones and the systemic issues kind of stick around, and those are harder to root out. So talk to me about that. What do you think today are the explicit barriers that are remaining and the implicit ones in our specialty as it relates to diversifying and making it more inclusive?
It's a great question.
Oh, yes. Just put this one down.
Really good question. I think we have to look at the history of the exclusion, and that usually will tie us into what's happening current day. So one of the impetus behind the manuscript, honestly, was there's a narrative out there that if there aren't that many Black and Latino plastic surgeons, and it's maybe because they're not interested in it, or maybe it just doesn't cater to those communities. And I wanted to show with this manuscript in particular pertaining to the Black American experience is the fact that Black Americans were systematically and structurally excluded for decades and decades. I mentioned Dr. Hickson, I mentioned Dr. Garnes, neither of which were board certified, neither of which were members of the ASPS, neither of which were members of the association. And there's a reason for that. It's not that they didn't want to be members, it's just because of our past. So as been articulated, the history of plastic surgery really was birthed as reconstructive surgery, birthed out of World War I. In 1921, the AAPS came into existence. Basically was filled with military surgeons who were caring for reconstructive patients. And unfortunately, when they started AAPS, it only included military physicians. Now, we had a segregated army until the early 1940s, and there were three things that prevented Black surgeons from being able to participate. One, because of a segregated army, the military wasn't overly excited about commissioning Black medical officers, so there are very few. Two, those few Black medical officers were kind of relegated to doing internal medicine and primary care. And then the third is that because we were in a Jim Crow America, the idea of a Black surgeon operating on a white surgeon led to this kind of imbalance of authority that was not accepted. So fast forward to 1931, ASPS comes into its existence. And the reason ASPS became a thing is because they wanted to broaden who was encompassed as a plastic surgeon. So they wanted to include cosmetic surgeons. They wanted to include hand surgeons. Unfortunately, they did not extend that inclusion to race and not gender either, actually. So in 1931, that only got worse because in 1941 that became worse because in 1941 the ASPS said, well, the only way you can become an ASPS member is if you're certified by the American Board of Plastic Surgery. The American Board of Plastic Surgery, which was established in 1941, said you could only be certified by the ABPS if you were a member of the AMA. Right. The AMA, long history of not wanting anything to do with Black and brown members. Right. They were actually forced to include Black and brown members just by civil rights legislation in the 1960s. So when we talk about like the systematic structural challenge that happened, it goes clearly back to those times. The reason that
each person along that path can point to, like, well, I'm not doing anything particularly bad. I'm just saying you have to be board certified.
Correct.
And so it's kind of a great example of you don't have to explicitly be biased and still have a problem.
Right. If the structure's in place and people aren't always aware of the structures, and we were not having a lot of conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion during that time, it perpetuates, right? Yeah. So Vincent Porter, he was the first diplomat of the American Board of Plastic Surgery, and that was 1968, right? A Black man. And then the first Black woman wasn't board certified by the American Board of Plastic Surgery until 1982. So, and I was born just a few years before that, and I'm not that old, right? So these kinds of things are just interesting to think about when we say, so what are the steps forward, and what's the narrative that we tell as we're putting in pathway and pipeline programs that have, again, caught some scrutiny?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's always the question, right? Which is, when you're, it's always easy in retrospect to say, these were the systemic things and these were the structural issues. When you're in the middle of it, sometimes it can be hard to know what those structural issues are that are holding us back right now. And so that's always the question, like, what do we think are the structural barriers now that are potentially causing us to not have as much of a diverse faculty and as much of a diverse workforce as we would like to have?
Well, I would say that now, I mean, there are a lot, from the women's perspective, there are a lot more women in plastic surgery now, so there are some role models there that were definitely not there for Alma when she went through all of this, and a lot of the other first female plastic surgeons. But I still think even if there are role models, you may not be exposed to them, right? So you may be in a community or at a medical school which doesn't have any role models, maybe doesn't have any plastic surgeons, doesn't have any women, you know, it doesn't have anybody that looks like you. So I think that's still always a barrier because people don't know I could do this. This could be something I can strive for because I don't see anybody that's like me that's doing it. So that's where these pipelines come in to help with that.
Yeah.
I'm going to echo Dr. Sommer's sentiments pertaining to that. I think early exposure and access is critical. Right?
Yeah.
There's 101 training programs in the country. That's it. And if you look at historically black colleges and universities, there are no training programs in any of those institutions, and they are the highest producers of black and brown medical students and then physicians. Right. So we have to consider broadening our programming and who we offer opportunities to. I think we need more plastic surgery training programs in the country.
Yeah.
I think these programs where we are bringing medical students from institutions that don't have plastic surgery training programs, we need to have more of them. We're blessed to have them at our institutions, but we could bring more. We need the finances to do it, but we could absolutely bring more.
Yeah. So I think that kind of connects to my next question, which is also something that was common between the two papers. Was it talked about, both papers talked about the importance of kind of the informal and the formal support structures that were built over time to drive the success of all these marginalized groups of surgeons. So, Dr. Sommer, as you noted in your paper, the Women Plastic Surgeons Forum was established in 1992, but informal events and informal kind of support structures were existing in 1979, a decade earlier. And Dr. Butler, you wrote that in the 1970s, the National Medical Association Conference kind of served as a forum for black plastic surgeons to network and find mentorship, and obviously that wasn't a formal thing meant for plastic surgeons. So tell us about how these informal networks are important and what benefits they provide to improve diversity.
Yeah. Well, I have a bit of a personal experience with this. So I know that a lot of what happened with making the women plastic surgeons more accepted, being able to develop their own forum, their own meeting places, their own committee, was because of male plastic surgeons who realized the importance of having women here and supported it. And I know that Dr. Zook, who is my father and was also chairman at SIU, was a huge proponent of that. I mean, he would go to every female event. He tried to push it. Now, did he do that because he had 3 daughters? Probably. I mean, probably him only having 3 daughters and no sons made him realize how important it was to push, to advocate for women. But I mean, it was because of that, I think. I mean, obviously all these women before that were really trying to be involved, but I really do think that having the other groups, the majority groups, the people in the majority groups standing behind and supporting them made a big difference, a big difference for us.
So the NMA came out of the 1970s because black and brown physicians couldn't get into the AMA for such an extended period of time, and the SNMA obviously was birthed out of the NMA. We are doing everything that we can in order to organize a little bit better to help teach our medical students, particularly those that are coming from institutions that don't have plastic surgery training programs, kind of the unwritten rules. Until we can, when we say this in our prepped program all the time, and until we can change the game, we have to teach them how to play the game. And that gets into the informal kind of mentorship that we provide. We are privileged now that we have increased representation in leadership. Carrie Woodbury became the first black female division chief of a plastic surgery program in 2019 at WVU, and Milton Armstrong's been a long-time division chief at MUSC and is now on the board, actually the first black person to serve on the American Board of Plastic Surgery. And then we have Steve Williams, who's now our illustrious president of ASPS. So we have these people for young people in the audience to emulate and to look up to. And these people, I am privileged to know them personally, they really feel the need to give back and to mentor both kind of formally as well as informally, and that's why ASPS meeting is such a good meeting for networking. The science is good, but I think the networking is even more profound.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to turn to our next paper, which is about underserved areas, specifically the demographic and experiential factors that are associated with medical students who intend to practice in underserved areas. So I thought this paper was interesting in a few ways. First of all, just as a note, I was surprised to see that plastic surgery had a greater representation of female and Hispanic medical students than other surgical subspecialties. I don't know if I have a question here. I was just interested in that result. Did you have any thoughts or insights on why that might be? It was just a surprising kind of data point.
Well, I think we've done better than some of the other specialties in making it attractive. I think particularly in the last 20 years. We've done all these kinds of events I'm pretty sure aren't happening across the spectrum of American surgery. So it was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, it's a good sign of progress and success, maybe. So you found that black medical students were more likely to declare an intention to practice in underserved areas than other students. What were your thoughts on why you think that is?
I want to back up just a second. So
Sure.
the first author, I give a lot of kudos to Mishi Nguyen, who was very well versed in AAMC data. I'm fairly well versed in AAMC data, but she's a guru, and she brought to my attention the fact that they do and all the young people in the audience know that there's the AAMC conducts a survey at the end of graduation for medical school.
Mm-hmm.
So we looked at 6 years worth of classes, over 90,000 students, which is just a wealth of health resource service data for folks like me. So we had never identified if there was an association between demographics as well as the students' experiences in medical school and their interest in plastic surgery, or their willingness to at least intend to carry out their practice in an underserved community.
Right.
So that's where it all started. We identified that, unfortunately, women and black students, self-identified black students, were not as interested in plastic surgery as men or those that came from majority ethnicities. The question you ask about black students, as well as those that had some kind of experiential learning, whether it's in a free clinic, had an interest or had an intent to practice, I think speaks to a couple things. I think in the black and brown community, there's just an understanding that you will serve your community in one way, shape, or form, because there's this concept of, it takes a village, particularly to put those into the field. So there's this feeling of I've got to give back. And I think what was even more profound for me, and what I've already taken to one of our deans there at Yale, is that we've proven that if a medical student, agnostic of gender, race, ethnicity, has experiences in a free clinic, or does community engagement as a medical student, they're much more likely to be interested in carrying out their practices in underserved communities. I think it's exposure. Now, some would say, well, the students that are going to engage in those activities from the jump are the ones that are probably going to practice in those communities later. But what if we mandated it, right? A soft mandate that you have to have some kind of experiential giving back as a medical student. It at least opens the eyes as to what's happening in the rest of the world, and definitely within the communities of those medical schools.
I have two questions about that, because exactly as you said, that jumped out at me about the fact that students who had an experience in global health or in community clinics were interested in in serving in underserved areas, and that absolutely goes to that whole correlation versus causation kind of problem, right? How do you tell whether it's just the nature of that student to be interested in that kind of thing? But it's an interesting idea to say, if you just expose everyone, and maybe it's an experiment that needs to be done where different schools can try it and see what happens. Certainly we have the data to track it. So
it's a nature and a nurture component is what you're getting at. I think that there are some that are just inclined to want to do that, and I think that part of our responsibility as academicians is to expose our learners to as many environments as humanly possible if the intent is to treat the greater good, or to treat all communities. So if we were able to expose them, I'm fairly confident there'd be more uptake in volunteerism in serving underserved and underprivileged communities.
I can't remember the author or what institution it came from, but I know there was an article either in PSN or in the journal that was a study a few years ago about No, not about just exposing residents to rural communities and how it increased their chances of going into a rural community when they finished residency.
Sure.
Do you guys remember who that was? There was an article
I
about
don't,
it. So it's along the same
but it
lines
seems to fit
that
exactly,
if you
yeah.
expose them to it, that helps to maybe change their mind, even for someone who wasn't necessarily on that path.
So the National Health Service Corps was kind of built around that concept, right? They give them loan repayment in order to go into underserved areas, particularly rural areas, and if they're and I think the commitment's 3 years, and their hope is that it's going to be tough to move after 3 years if you've established a practice.
Right.
But again, I think it's a different kind of incentivizing, but I think it works.
Yeah, I mean, it stands to reason, right? If just being exposed to something, some number of people who are exposed are going to say, I like this. And, the ones who weren't going to say that won't, but there's going to be a non-zero number, and it should improve your numbers for sure. Going back to what you said about black medical students, perhaps, or black and brown medical students being kind of almost having this expectation of having to give back and being expected to go back and be in underserved communities. Do you think that's a burden? Do you think it's an unfair burden on them?
So I should qualify that, right? There's no black or brown monolithic experience,
Sure.
right? But if I'm to take all comers as it pertains to that demographic, I think that there is a sense of and a desire to give back. That's just maybe my bias and my lived experience. Is it a burden? Yes and no. I think many take it on as a kind of badge of honor to do. I think it can become exhausting, and we talk about the tax that's associated with certain demographic groups when it comes to this kind of work in particular. So yes, it's something to be mindful of, but I don't think it's a dissuader. Yeah.
Fair. So again, I think this paper, and I mean, of course, it's part of the mini-series, so it makes sense that it would do this, but it connects well to the last two. We want to improve access to care in underserved areas, and the way to do it is perhaps to have more of these formal mentorship structures to get these type of students into these experiences and to show them what that would be like and perhaps push them into doing it. But perhaps you also need some informal structures and informal pipelines. So I feel like, again, this is kind of well connected to the last two papers about how to improve this diversity through these structures of mentorship.
I mean, I think that obviously mentorship and sponsorship are both very, very important, and we can develop pipelines, we can develop, structures to do that within our societies. But I also think it's always also very important for the students themselves, especially the students who know they are. I mean, some of these pipelines are obviously for students who don't even know they like plastic surgery. It's our way of encouraging more diversity by getting people interested in plastic surgery who wouldn't be. Mm-hmm. But for the students who are already interested in plastic surgery, just being able to get them in, unfortunately, sometimes all the burden falls on them to try to figure out how to do this. Who do I go to? Who do I talk to? So, our societies are trying to figure out ways that we can make that available to them. But I think we still have, a ways to go in really making that transparent and easy.
Yeah.
We frequently, on the female representation front and the URIM representation front, talk about these pathways and pipelines being filled at both ends or shored up on the end, right? The leaky pipeline that everybody sees. We've got to shore up the holes while we're filling in the pipeline kind of further upstream. I think great evidence of that is, you see this attrition from medical student representation to resident to junior faculty to senior faculty to chair, right? Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, there's 101 training programs in the country. Only 5 are led by Black or Latino surgeons. Right. That can't happen, and that's not sustainable if we're going to support all of the young people that come to us looking for mentorship and hopefully sponsorship. You have to have people in those positions to be able to sponsor, right? Yeah. So whether it's informally done or not, I think formally we have to figure out ways in order to continue to move people along the continuum and support them. And those sponsors are likely going to come from majority demographics.
Statistically speaking, yeah. Makes sense. Okay, so turning to our last paper, the paper about facial transplantation, where again I felt the theme of implicit versus explicit bias was strong. There are unique barriers that Black patients have when it comes to being recipients of facial transplantation. So tell us a little bit about that, Dr. Butler.
Okay, so full disclosure, this probably doesn't happen if I'm not at Yale.
Yeah.
My new division chief arguably has one of the greatest experiences in the world of, definitely in the country, maybe arguably in the world with facial vascularized composite allotransplantation, Bo Pomahawk. And there was a former lab resident of his who's now one of our residents, Martin Kalki, who's the first author on the paper, who Dr. Pomahawk sent him to me to say, hey, it's interesting. We're seeing a trend in who's receiving face transplants. And I've had the privilege of kind of writing in the disparity space pertaining to breast reconstruction challenges and hand surgery and hernia surgery and basically everything that us plastic and reconstructive surgeons touch. There's a disparity associated with it pertaining to race and ethnicity. So why not look at facial VCA? So Martin was able to find and identify the fact that since 2002, from 2002 to 2020, I thought there had been more, but 47 face transplants have been performed throughout the world. 17 of those were performed in the United States. And of those 17, 16 were performed on white patients. One was performed on a black patient, none on Latino, and none that came from indigenous backgrounds. So I think, again, we should disclose the fact that it's a very small number. Right? And we can't prove statistical significance. We can only show a trend. And maybe this is a disparity that we can kind of cut off at the pass before we can actually say it's truly disparate care.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I thought what was an interesting thing about the paper was what it kind of had interesting things to say about the special barriers, unique barriers that patients with more melanin in their skin are always going to have to facial transplantation, because you've got the issues of, having to match color much more closely, for example, or even other facial features. It's going to be a little bit more difficult, right? I mean, it's just not the same thing.
Yeah, so very interestingly, so 17 in the U.S. over that period of time, just one black patient. Dr. Pomahawk had the privilege of being his surgeon, and when I was talking to Bo about it, he said that the patient actually had turned down the face transplant opportunity 2 years prior because it wasn't an appropriate color match, and he and his family were like, well, we're just going to wait. So without question, it is something that has to be considered. Your question pertaining to additional barriers physically is, how do we assess for acute rejection?
Yeah.
Right. Rejection in a black face is going to look different than somebody that's lighter complected. We did comment that there's growing information that doing mucosal biopsies will be appropriate and is appropriate to assess for acute rejection in face transplant. So that might get around that in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. But again, there are going to be some challenges, but I think we're smart enough to figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same kind of challenge that you have when you're doing a free flap on a very dark-skinned patient versus a very light-skinned patient. It's hard to see the venous congestion. It makes life much more difficult. And even with the best of intentions and the best of care, there may be disparate outcomes because of the fact that it's more difficult, right?
I mean, Doppler's helped with microsurgery, but it's not necessarily going to help with a rejection, right? Because we are almost completely dependent on the skin to tell us the story. But if we can use the mucosa instead of the skin, then obviously that's an opportunity.
Yeah. I thought there was an interesting connection here between this paper and, again, back to our first two papers, because you wrote about, the pioneers like Dr. Ofodile, Dr. Perlman Hicks, Dr. Pierce, who were figuring out how the ethnic nose or the ethnic cosmetic surgery was not like this, just a pigmented version of the Caucasian nose or the Caucasian cosmetic surgery. It wasn't just a singular category. And I feel like, again, this is the same kind of thing where you can't just treat the facial transplant in a patient of color as being just the pigmented version of not, right? I mean, I feel like it connects nicely to this thing that they were working on 50 years ago.
So in the 1980s, in the cosmetic space, that's when the black and brown community starts to really get interested and adopt an interest in plastic surgery on the cosmetic side. And that was because there were a fair number of entertainers that decided to have plastic surgery, like Michael Jackson and Sammy Davis Jr. And Ebony Magazine actually wrote an article about that. Unfortunately, none of those plastic surgeons were board certified, but they were doing a lot of cosmetic surgery. And if you follow kind of time and you look at the Irma Tories who started writing about, making sure that we were not Caucasianizing the nose when a black or brown person came in for a rhinoplasty. I think that really started to resonate again with the community that, yes, we can enhance you without, taking away your ethnic identity. And I think that that's critical. How that translates to, face transplant, I think it goes along with the fact that a black or brown person probably does not want a traditionally, white face.
Right.
And I think that that's okay. I think it's allowed us to be more mindful of these things that are, nuanced, but obviously incredibly important.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a little bit of a continuation.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing is, in the 1980s, when they look back, only about 5 to 10% of those receiving cosmetic surgery were non-white. In the 90s, that grew to 20%, and then as of 2020, it's over 40%. That was a number that I was actually really surprised about.
That's a very high number. It's surprising. Yeah.
One thing that made me think of was, I do think that there's still a lack of information in our journals and in our educational system on what standards would be for different ethnicities. I know they're working on it. They're trying to get more of that published, but I'd say there's a real lack in that. Even here at the meeting, we don't have, focused educational talks that deal with that, which would be, I think, wonderful to see.
Yeah, that's a good example there of like the things like, the ideal nasolabial angle, or the ideal this or the ideal that. We probably need those kinds of things, but divided by ethnicity, right? It's not the same for everybody. It's very silly to say this is the ideal nasolabial angle for every single patient. It's obviously not true. The anthropometrics, things like that. It makes sense that we have a lot of work to do to get there. Well, those are the main questions I had about these 4 papers, and thank you very much for participating. I would like to open it up to questions from the audience if there are any questions.
Hi, thank you for this great discussion. My name is Emily Long. I'm a resident at the Harvard Beth Israel program. In the last couple of years, Step 1 has become pass-fail, and medical schools are increasingly making grades pass-fail as well. So the driving factor in looking at applications is research numbers. And more medical students walking around this lovely meeting today, half of them are out on a research year, which is very expensive and costly and time-consuming, which isn't necessarily accessible to students who don't come from more wealthy, privileged backgrounds. So how do you think that's going to impact our field long-term in terms of who's applying to plastic surgery to begin with, and what can we do to combat that?
Well, I know that our academic group, the ACAPs or ACEPs now, has talked a lot about that, because we realize that, right? That we're trying to improve diversity, and then we have all these things potentially going against us for that. We've talked about it with the whole virtual interview process. That was a lot less expensive for people. Why don't we just keep it that way? Because more people can interview at more places because they don't have to travel. All of those things. So there are pros and cons to all of the different options. But so we are thinking about it, but I don't know that we have great solutions for it, because you're right. Obviously you have to be. It's an advantage to be able to take a year off, right? Not everybody can do that. That is an expensive endeavor. As of right now, obviously there is still Step 2. If that goes away, that's going to make things even more difficult. I think we're at our level, the academic chairman level, and program director level, we're trying to figure this out, but we don't really have great solutions yet.
It's a really good question. I wrestled with this a lot. Many may have thought that I would have been a proponent of going pass-fail for Step 1, and I actually was not. I wanted to keep the score because I knew how to mentor my mentees pertaining to the game, and I knew what was going to happen is that they would change that metric. That focus metric was just going to be pivoted, and we were going to move the goalpost in a different way. Now it's going to be a number of peer-reviewed publications, or, God forbid, the pedigree in which you were privileged to come from as it pertained to medical school. The answer is a complex one. ACAPS is doing a lot of work, or ACEPS is now doing a lot of work looking into it. I'm fortunate to be at a medical school that allows the medical students to take a 5th year without charging them tuition, right? So, but not everybody does that, but maybe medical schools should consider offering that as an option, since it's turning into a prerequisite now for my poor medical students to get into plastic surgery training programs without doing a year of research. So I think we're going to have to be nimble, and we're going to have to look kind of. I think the ship sailed. I think this, kind of infatuation with number of peer-reviewed publications is here to stay. I think one wonderful thing that ACAPS and ACEPS now has done is that we're not looking at quantity anymore. We're going to look at quality over quantity. So I much prefer, when I'm about to review all of these applications this coming weekend, I look at the quality of the manuscripts and where their authorship order is, rather than the student that sends me the CV that has 12 manuscripts and the middle author on all of them and they can't speak articulately to any of them. So I'm hoping that's where we go with this. Great question.
So I kind of think in line with the previous. Yeah, so I think in line with the previous question, with all these things kind of working against diversity in plastic surgery, and also with now the trend of more programs going strictly into integrated and there being less independent programs now, can you guys speak on, how do you feel about that new direction, and ultimately how would that impact diversity moving forward?
Well, I do think that it's on the onus of the programs to start doing more holistic reviews, and because we're not going to have these exams to go by. I mean, we should have probably been doing that even before when we had the exams, honestly. So it's really on us to do more holistic reviews to look at the total person. And I think that the new application process is helping with that, because we get some of the most important information about that person instead of a lot of just lists of things. So I do think it will help us to do that better. But that's the thing, is I think we need to come up with strategies to make sure that we are not doing a disservice to the people who we are trying to actually bring into the system.
And I would argue that going more with there being more integrated programs than independent programs, we could enhance the opportunity for diversification, because these medical students are primed in a way that they know from the jump that they want to be plastic and reconstructive surgeons, where the independent model, I trained for 12 years. Nobody should train for 12 years, but you can imagine the level of attrition when you have a system where it's 5 years of general surgery, 2 or 3 years of research, and then 3 years of an independent residency, right? Like, that's a lot of opportunity for people to fall off. So if we can get more integrated programs with a broad lens of who we're including, I think I'm actually pretty optimistic about us diversifying the field.
Yeah, it does seem like the switch from independent to integrated programs should help with the lack of, with there being one decision point. So hopefully there's a specific spot to focus on, which is that transition from medical school to residency. The fact that it's a shorter period of time will hopefully decrease the barriers. But it does seem like there's like this never-ending arms race, right? I mean, you hear this from every program director, where they look at the applications coming in and they say, my God, if I was applying now, I would never get in, because the scores just keep going up and the publications just keep going up and everything just keeps going up. And so in a sense, it just keeps getting harder. And so the problem of how to help, increase diversity in the resident population doesn't get any easier, right? Because of this arms race. Yep, please.
Dr. Butler, just want to follow up with your initial statement about more or less scrutinizing someone's research work, and how would you kind of like discern how one paper is like, hey, this is a quality paper? Because from speaking with other from other programs, they say, hey, we just look at the publication number and then that's it. But then some other people will actually want to look at the breadth of that work, whether it's clinical or basic science. So are you looking at, hey, yes, they're first author, but like, what journal did they submit to, or something like that? So what is your litmus test to kind of define the quality of someone's work? Because yes, they can be first author, but like, is it quality work that is actually being beneficial to like patient care, something like that, or patient outcomes?
It's a great question. So in totality is how we should be assessing, right? Like, holistic review is not just looking at the actual location of the name on the reference. It's looking at the title. It's looking at the journal in which it was published. So, those residency program leaders that say we're just looking at the number, I think that's flawed. Those that are really committed to holistic review and taking into account the quantity over the quality, the whole reason that many of us cared about, the number of peer-reviewed publications is that we wanted medical students that knew how to carry out the scientific process in hopes that we could convince them to become academicians. That was the goal, right? So somebody who is a first author, we know that they came up with the project idea, they created their methods, they knew how to assess results, they knew how to make it an appropriate discussion, then they knew how to take the badgering of reviewers in order to put it into publication form. Like, that's an exhaustive process if you are the first author or the senior author for the most part. So that's why I put a lot of credence on the placement of them. And then if you read the title and you look at the journal, then we know if it's a high impact journal or not. So again, I'm going to emphasize the quality over the quantity, and there are ways that we can make that assessment rather easily.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Hey, Jeff Friedrich from Seattle. I really appreciate this discussion, particularly because I have a stack of applications that I have to review, like all of you are. I think a lot about representation, and I think it's important that our trainees and even our physician complement should represent the communities that they're caring for. But I also gotta get really close to this mic, apparently. I think a lot about what communities should we kind of peg that representation to. I'm in a part of the country that, quite honestly, doesn't have a lot of black and brown representation. And so what do we aim for is my first question with that. And my second question is, for people that are applying for programs that don't have a lot of, for example, representation in their own group, whether it's a program with not very many women or a community that doesn't have a lot of black and brown representation, how do we find those people with what really has to be kind of a pioneering spirit and somebody that knows they're going to have to be kind of a first in that community or one of the first in that community? How do we find that trait, those pioneering people?
So is your question for representation such as like in the faculty there's not a lot of representation, or in the community that like where you are? Is that?
Well, in the community where we are, right?
Okay.
But in terms of what I'm looking for, what we as a program are looking for in terms of our residents,
Right.
What representation are we aiming for? Is it that little community or the larger country? And
Right. I mean, I think it probably depends on your community, but I would guess almost every community in the U.S. has pockets of minorities, right? It may not be, they may not tend to go to University of Washington, but maybe they go to a community hospital that then you as faculty could get involved in taking care of patients there. So, so you can sort of spread your wings in your own community to maybe get more exposure. That's the only thing I can think of as far as that goes. And then the second question was about...
Yeah. So, two very good questions. I'll take the second one because Dr. Sommer took the first one. So, you're right. Most of our institutions aren't going to have the demographics that are reflective of the patient populations we treat. So what do you do in those instances? So that's where we lean on our national identity-based surgical organizations. So the American College of Surgeons kind of recognizes 5, the Association of Women Surgeons, the Society of Black Academic Surgeons, the Latino Surgical Society, the Society of Asian Academic Surgeons, and the Association of ALT Surgeons and Allies. At my institution, we are formal sponsors of all 5 of those organizations, so we can send our residents to those identity-based organizations so they get those mirroring mentorship opportunities, which is super powerful. So until you can build that cohort within your faculty or at your institution, I think this is an amazing opportunity and venue in order to kind of do that, to ensure that they're supported, and hopefully they come back to your institution even more spirited to serve as those champions, because without question it requires the champions. Your first question's a good one, and we wrestle with this a lot. My personal bias is that we should, in academic plastic surgery, because we have so few training programs, we need to create a workforce that's reflective of the national population, not necessarily just the pocket in which we're privileged to serve, whether it's New Haven or Philadelphia or what have you.
Anybody else? Okay, well, if you don't have anything else, I think we will wrap it up. Dr. Butler, Dr. Sommer, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. I think we all learned a lot, and really appreciate you being here.